Well, hello there, fellow travelers. Thank you for joining me again. This is episode 25 of the Unbroken Ground. My name is Paul, and thank you for hopefully listening to lots of my podcasts, or if this is your first time, welcome. Continue to talk about just what it means to follow Jesus. This week, the title of the podcast is Who's the Boss? And I want to think about and maybe ramble about. I'm thinking out loud a little bit here, maybe more so than I have in the past on some things where I had definitely had an end in mind. But for this one, I definitely want to consider what it means to have unity and the ways that we accomplish that. And looking at a couple of different ideas, authority, Jesus' leadership, and the church, the early church specifically, and then also some of the things that I've seen and experienced in the church of the modern day. So yeah, that's the idea. If you have any things to add, any questions, as always, you can find me on Facebook / The Unbroken Ground, email theunbrokenground@gmail.com, or you can find me Instagram _unbroken ground something like that. Look up the Unbroken Ground, you find me on Instagram. So thank you for listening, and hope that you enjoy. And again, if you have thoughts to add, Facebook page or email, great places to do that. And let's jump in. So some of you know this, some of you don't. I am a ordained Baptist minister. Grew up in Texas, and so was always a member of Southern Baptist churches. Went to a seminary that was duly aligned with the Baptist General Convention of Texas, which is now called Texas Baptist, and the Southern Baptist Convention. And can't help but think about the things that are going on through the conventions, through the Southern Baptist Convention, and it's not necessarily new things or even things that I have not experienced in my lifetime. When I was so many of the things that have happened that I just didn't pay any attention to, wasn't a major part. I mean, to be honest, you could be a member of a Baptist church and really not engage in any of the major battles that they've had over the years. You could have been a member of a Baptist church and just been part of your community, and your contributions to the Southern Baptist Convention is simply that we give. That's one of the ways that we do missions, and so Baptist churches are very efficient in that they pool their money together and then send missionaries out as one big mission sending organization. And so that's what the Southern Baptist Convention really does well. I mean, they have things that break off of the SBC, obviously the International Mission Board and the National North American Mission Board, which are the mission sending organizations that a lot of the smaller towns and churches can use, that they probably wouldn't be able to do if they didn't partner with the SBC. And so there's a lot of things that they do that make it great in a lot of ways. But then there are also just the struggles that exist, and some of that I think just lives in the idea of like where authority is found and who has authority, and for the Baptist faith, this is always where it's been a little bit strange to me or unique, and how things work is that the priesthood of all believers is that every believer has their connection with God. There's no one that needs to go in between them. They can read the scriptures, and they don't have to have anybody explain it to them. They don't have to have anybody interpret it for them. They all have that ability of being able to do that for themselves. And so then following that model, every church is in of itself a unique and autonomous organization. And so being part of the Southern Baptist Convention is actually a very bottom up kind of organization structure. It has been. And of course, now with the recent conservative fundamental takeover, if you even want to call it that, is probably glossing over way too much, but it has started to disenfranchise places, churches. For example, the biggest one being, of course, Rick Warren's church in California, Saddleback. Of course, he's not the pastor there anymore, but because of having a woman pastor. And also, the cynical part of me thinks that one of the reasons that disenfranchising has become more of a possibility is because of dealing with the misbehaviors of pastors, sexual or otherwise, and the history of sweeping under the rug, not necessarily protecting, but sometimes protecting, but sweeping under the rug the misbehaviors of past SBC pastors and staff, and so having that ability to say, well, if you have this pastor who has been accused of these things, or even who's been convicted of these things, we don't think you can belong to us. But the cynical side of me says that, as it has always been, if you look into why the SBC has done what they've done along those realms, is that they've done the most just to protect themselves, and so to avoid any liability in a way, because they would say they don't have authority to hold any pastor accountable. They are disenfranchising churches to say that, well, you can't be part of the SBC. And then others have seized upon that and have wanted for some time to be like, well, we don't agree with, for example, having women ministers, and so they too should be disenfranchised from us. Obviously, those are at different realms and different reasons, and so those are not equal things. But I do think that some people have taken advantage of that and unfortunately taken some tragedy and turned it into their own crusades of what they've wanted to do for some time. So it just brings up to my mind, the idea of authority. And I think that I'm wrestling through this too because of some dynamics of that always exist in churches, in places I've worked, places I work, where there is a central structure of authority, but they don't. But then there's also people who have responsibility, but maybe not direct authority. For example, if you just think about the idea of like a church staff, the pastor has some authority, but in most cases, depending on your tradition and where you're at, the Baptist, which is congregational, the pastor has as much authority as any other member because everybody gets their own vote. And although there are some things that the congregation cedes, I guess, in a little bit of authority to the pastor, but in other things you have like elder-led authority, and so the pastor is one of many elders. And so the idea of how do you bring about unity that is not I can't say that. That is just not being like a dictator. How do you bring about unity in ways that is just not saying like, well, I'm the person in charge, so you're just going to do what I say, authority based. how does that work in churches and places we work, and what does Jesus say about that, and what do the church do to do that? And so I think the first thing is just to I guess understand or try to parse out the idea of what we're looking for. And I think the idea of unity is this idea that we are moving together with a common cause or a common purpose, and that we want to accomplish the same things. And so a church has a common goal, a common purpose. A business has a common goal, a common purpose, and we all want to achieve the same things. And each one of us has a different role, a different thing, a place where we fit in that. And then we even have some different ideas about how to do that, or even different skills on how we accomplish that. Like we with unity, we're just not trying to create uniformity, because that gets into a very cult-like atmosphere. It's like, well, if you want to be unified, then everybody has to look uniform. Everybody wears the same clothes. Everybody has the same ideas, and everybody has the same, like, everything is done based upon, a lot of times, by whatever the charismatic leader says. And so so uniformity is an offshoot of unity, but it is not the only type of unity, nor, I would say, is it the unity that Jesus shows. Jesus prays that we would have, as believers, we would have harmony, and that we would have unity, in the same way that Jesus and God are one, in the same way that Jesus, God, and the Holy Spirit are one. Three, you unified but separate. And so they're not uniform. So even if you just look at the Trinity, they are unified in purpose, but they are separate in personhood, and also in the way that they interact, and the responsibilities that they have in the world. And so, which is a little hard to understand, because the Trinity is hard to understand. So that's not. Don't get lost too much in that, but the idea that there is unity there, but there's not uniformity, in the sense that they are distinct. And so sometimes when we think about unity, we begin to think like, well, everybody has to look, think, and be the same. And so what happens when you try to create unity with uniformity is that you create rules. Spoken or unspoken. And so, like, I think we have to address, like, a deep, to be a mature take on this, is that we have to understand that there are both the expressed written rules of the world, and as they exist, of the church, and then there's also the unwritten rules, the culture that develops based on the things that the leaders and the people are allowed to do and say, the things that are celebrated. Those are the things that help create this culture, this underlying understanding of how you can fit into the very fabric of the organization, where you fit out and work. And so you begin to, there's these rules that you develop, and it's like, well, everybody follow the rules and then the processes, and then you get into the old habit of, this is the way that we've always done it. This is the way that we have to do it, because we've always done it this way. And so a lot of that, then the authority then begins to fall into the realm of the rule makers. Whoever makes the rules has the authority, and a lot of times the community itself will self-police the uniformity in such a way that if anybody doesn't fit in, then they, even though they could be unified, because they could have unity of purpose and spirit, and they could all be headed towards the same goal, because they don't uniformly fit in, then they can be kicked out. And so I think that that's what I think you see, like, with, like, the SBC. So this idea that if you have a woman who's a pastor, and there's a wording there that they've got to figure out, and I don't know the wording. I haven't followed it that close. Can a woman be a children's pastor? Or do they have to be a children's minister? Do they have to be a director of ministry? children's director, all those things. And but there are people who the authority then rests with those who make the rules, those who make like this is what is in and this is what is out. And where we get into danger is when we begin to ascribe a spiritual authority that is unquestioned to someone such as a pastor or a leader or someone like the president of the SBC, or a committee. When we begin to say, well, there are spiritual leaders, so they get to make the rules. And again, that becomes very cult-like-ish in the idea of you're in because you're willing to agree to what the leader says. And I don't think that there's anybody. I would actually argue that there are many ministers, and even ministers that sit on the executive committee of the SBC, that they would not want that, and they don't view that. Like, they would say, "Oh, well, this is not what we're doing." So they would make that argument. But I think that you have to at least address that, like, at an extreme. Like, unity can come from uniformity, and from the culture of saying, well, here is our authority, our spiritual authority. And some even, like, churches would even say, well, our Bible is the spiritual authority. But really what they're saying is how we interpret it, and how we agree that it's interpreted is our spiritual authority, and it's uniform. And it's different than other religions, not just religions, sorry, but denominations, other people who have Christianity, and it's different. And so they would say, yeah, it exists because of these rules and how we follow these rules, and if this is what we believe about the Bible, this is what we believe the Bible says. And so in some ways, you have denominations that have worked harder to define the in and out. If you're in, then you believe this. If you're out, then you believe this. And so you see some moving, and you see some changing in things like the Methodist denomination, where they broke off into two different camps because they are no longer united. That's a really bad joke. But they have some churches that believe one way about certain things, and again, I haven't looked into the whole issues, but yeah, the idea of, like, authority and unity is something that's super interesting to me, because I think that, like, if you look at Jesus and his disciples, he did not have uniformity. He had disciples that came from all different types of life. He had fishermen, he had tax collectors, he had zealots, he had devout practicing Jews, he had probably some people who hadn't been to the temple in a while. He had women who followed him. He had just a long list of different things that did not create conformity within those who followed him. He didn't have uniformity, but he did have unity of purpose. But even that, we could say that, like, he had Judas, who in the end was not willing to stay with the unity, and broke off for his many reasons that he did that. But how did Jesus create unity? And I think it goes back to basically just the fact that he said, here is two things that he said. One was this: he said, if you want to come after me, then you're going to love your brothers. If you want to follow me, then you'll follow me by demonstrating that by your love, by who you love and how you love. And he said, the easiest way to determine to explain the law is to say that love God with all your heart, mind, and soul, and love others as yourself. And the fact that he made that the kind of, like, if you want to be in, if you want to be a part, this is what you do. You love God with all you have, and you love others as yourself. And and I think when that became the test, that became the litmus test to whether you were going to follow Jesus or not. It really got to some very concrete, hard things that mattered, like issues of the heart. And because that happened, some people were not willing to hang around. There were those who just weren't with it. But then there were other people. There's a story where the disciples said, "Jesus, this guy's casting out demons in your name, and he's not one of us." And Jesus says, "Hey, if he's for us, then he's not against us. He is like don't count him out. Don't make like he. You're trying to create uniformity. He doesn't follow like you guys do, but still, he's not against us. He's with us. He's for us." And that's just such a strange thing, because Jesus definitely has another moment where he's teaching, and he begins to teach about these people who do these great things in his name, but he says, "Away from me, you never knew me." And this is, of course, the parable about the sheep and the goats. And the goats say, "But Jesus, we did great miracles in your name, and we built great buildings, and we raised all the money, and we served all the poor, and we did all these things." And Jesus says, "I never knew you." And the sheep go, "Well, when did we see you? When did we see you, Jesus? When did we serve you?" And he was like, when you've done things of the least of these." And so I think you have to at least consider the fact that the idea is that you can create a culture that recreates the things, that mimics the things that Jesus knew that his followers would do, but you could do it without ever including Jesus in it. And to me, that brings great pause, because I don't ever want to find myself in that place, to where I could say, well, we've got it figured out. And instead of asking and allowing Jesus to guide, we say, well, we're going to do what we know we should do. But let us not be that way. I mean, I think that at times we just need to come before Jesus and just say, "God, I don't know. I don't understand." And there is just a whole lot of ego and pride that gets mixed up into leadership when we are thinking about our influence and whether or not we can change and affect the behaviors of those people who are around us, and those people who, if you're the pastor, the church that serves under you, that you serve, that they have elevated you to this place of authority, or if you're at work and you have employees and you need them to follow certain guidelines and rules, and where that authority comes from, and how do we express that authority, and so we just so we have to look for those ways. We want uniformity because we want to be able to do things what we believe is the right way, and I think that is one of the things that is hardest about dealing with things like church conflicts, is that I think most people in the church, and those who have conflict, believe that they are doing the right thing. The people who get angry about what color the paint is or the carpet is, do so out of I believe, a direct responsibility they feel that they have to the church and to the history of the church and to the culture of the church, and they are following Jesus as they know how. It doesn't matter that they're dead wrong, or they could be dead wrong, and I think that actually doesn't matter to them. And I think that actually is where I come back to the idea of like the goats and the sheep, is that we have to at least keep in mind that we could be wrong, that we totally missed it, especially as leaders, especially as When we make assumptions, when we make judgment calls, we have to be willing to be humble enough to realize that sometimes we made the wrong decision. That we went off the basis of the facts, our understanding, our beliefs, are what we thought we knew. And sometimes we're just wrong. Sometimes that we did our best. We prayed. We sought God's face. And yet we missed the mark. And when leaders get into the place where they can't admit that, where they are unable to admit that they have frailty, that they are not always right, that they have moments where they're lost, that they have to depend upon God just like we do. A lot of leaders shy away from that because their authority is that they are the ones who know more, who are closer to God, who understand more about God's word, or understand more about His will, or understand or have a vision, and so they just like many leaders, politicians especially, they shy away from being apologetic or being truthful and honest because they worry about how it will affect their leadership. And so they hide their mistakes. They cover up their shortcomings. They use anger and defensiveness whenever they are approached, or whenever their ideas are questioned, or whenever somebody says, I have questions. I don't know if I want to go in this direction. And so then they are like, well, you're just disloyal to me. You're not part of it. And I think it's just so hard because the fact of the matter is that for sure, maybe you do have that vision as a leader. Maybe you do need to follow through, and people holding on to the brake sometimes are wrong too. Some people are hesitant, and they stand as a obstacle in what God wants to do. And so how do you determine that? And so how do you find those ways, again, of finding unity? Because unity is that we are all going to gather together for this common purpose. And like this authoritarian power is a way that a lot of people do that. Like, you will listen to me because there are consequences, and those consequences a lot of times in the aspect of the community of the church is that I will drive you out. You won't be a part of us anymore. I will call you out for who you are. I will call you out for your lack of faith. I'll call you out for your lack of trust, of your lack of getting along with what the church says that they're going to do. And it causes these human conflicts because we feel like we have to have unity, and if it's authority based, then any threat to your authority, anybody who says, "Hey, hold on a second, I have some questions," becomes a liability. And I think that's one of the reasons why Jesus doesn't set up a human kingdom. The people wanted to. It says in Scripture that they even were searching for him because they wanted to make him king. And they couldn't find him. He slipped away because he knew their hearts, and he knew that any kind of authoritative, top-down regime to set up, like, you do it like I say or you're out, actually creates rebellion. It creates resurrection, but resistance, and it creates the idea that you create something to fight against. And that's why Jesus chose a different way. That's why God chose a different way. And the unity actually is found in the fact that if you love God, you obey his commands. And the unity is found in that because the invitation is that if you love God, remembering all the things that God did through Jesus, even before you were saved, even while you were still a sinner, everything that God did, remembering all of that, and that's what Paul basically says. That's what the gospel says. What Jesus says. It says, if you remember all the things that you were, all the things that you've been saved from, all the things that you've been freed, you found salvation and freedom, and because of that you love God. Then because you love God, you'll obey his commands. And if you follow him, then you will be unified in purpose with those who want to follow Jesus. Now, that doesn't mean it'll all look the same. There are types of worship and places that I feel comfortable in and other places I don't. And that's okay. Those people are not any less following God than I am just because they do things a little bit different. But when you have authority that says, no, you have to listen to what I say, human authority, and then that authority becomes questions, what you see denominations splinter, and you see the church ununified, you see disunity, you see, because when the human side of things tries to hold so hard onto things, the system breaks down. And so I don't know that I've come to any great conclusions about how to bring about unity. But I do think that for too many years, for too many approaches, we've just tried to use positional authority. Well, we do this because the manager says so. We do this because the pastor says so. We do this because the leader of the organization says that's the way we're going to do that. Rather than relational authority or a relationship authority, which is what Jesus says. Like Jesus is like, you follow me because you love me, and if you love me, then you'll obey my commands. But it starts in the relationship. See, that you can make enough rules. The 10 Commandments are rules that you can follow, and they're actually good for you. I mean, they would make for a better life if you follow them. Then your life would be better. But it doesn't really have anything to do with Jesus. If you just follow them because you're like, well, those seem like good rules, then you don't have this relationship. But what Jesus is inviting us into this relationship where he says, hey, I know the best way to live. Come follow me. And you go, okay, well, Jesus, why should I follow you? And it says, because I loved you. John 3:16, the most famous verse in the world. God so loved the world. Because I loved you. Come follow me. And I think that the hard part of a relational unity, authority, is that you can just be rejected. Some people will just outright reject that. Well, I'm not going to follow Jesus. What has he ever done for me? Who is he? What are you even talking about? And as people, we find rejection really hard to deal with. And so we tend to drift back towards authoritarian, which is if you reject the leader, if you reject the things I say you should do, then there's consequences. Now, there are consequences when we don't follow what God has asked us to do, what Jesus says we should do. There are consequences, but they're like self-fulfilling. Like, you know what, if you don't love people, if you don't care for people, then your life is going to be so much less joy-filled. It's going to be so much more shallow and not have meaningful relationships. But it's not in the sense of like, oh, Jesus is just sitting there going, oh, well, you didn't follow the rules, so you're going to get your punishment. But that is a lot of the ways that we try to regulate behavior in school, in church, in our workplaces. Look, here's the rules, follow them, or you get in trouble. You can get fired. You can get detention. You can get kicked out of the church because you didn't follow the rules we set up. And I think that can create a culture of uniformity. But the difference is, but authoritarianism causes rebellion. it causes us to push back against that. And so we have to find a way. If you want to be an authority, great, but find a way to rule with unity through relationship, through relational things, through asking people to be a part, in because that just seems to be the superior way of doing that. That's not the final word on that. I'm still thinking through that. I'm still rambling through as I think about how do we bring about unity. But I think that I think that's where I land, is that the struggle with a top down authority trying to create unity is that in general they create uniformity and rules and a culture that enforces those rules but has no real relationship. And if ever the authority is wrong or something doesn't go like they say it should go, then that authority loses its reasoning and people have a reason not to follow it. And I think that that's why it's so hard in these past 30 years. What we've seen is the rise of the authoritarian pastor, the authoritarian politician, and the results of that, things being covered up, people looking the other way when pastors do things, when they treat other pastors poorly, pastors refusing to admit that they have mistakes or that they're sinful, that they need Jesus just as much as we do, because that would damage their authority, and their authority is very you do what I say, and I think that is the danger, because in the end it's like being the king of Israel. You may be the king of Israel, but God is the real authority. And so, how do you live in that? It's such a hard stretch to live in, because you are the king, but God is in charge. You are the king, but God is the one who's worshipped, and He is the one who gets the glory. And so that's the question. Maybe we'll talk about it again a little bit more next week too. Maybe I'll jump to another discussion. But the idea is, how do we create a society that needs authority but also needs unity? And how do we do that well as a church? How do we do that well at our jobs? How do we do that well if we're in charge of people? May we look to Jesus, and may He give us insight into how we can do the things the way He would want us to do them. Have a blessed week.